I recently watched Strange Brew, the 1983 Canadian comedy starring Dave Thomas and Rick Moranis as the legendary McKenzie Brothers. Welcome to Canadian Corner, where I watch the best and worst of Canadian content on my quest to becoming the most prolific reviewer of all time. And honestly, I really wanted to like it. This is one of those movies that has become a Canadian cult classic. People love it, it's been quoted for decades, and I'm sure that in 1983, there were plenty of people who thought it was hilarious, but watching it now, I gave it a 2 out of 10. And I don't think that's necessarily because the movie is old. I think it's because comedy is one of those things that doesn't always age well. Some comedies can be decades old and still be incredibly funny, like Third Rock from the Sun. It just works for me. I can watch it today and laugh at the jokes. Strange Brew, not so much. I may have actually seen this movie when I was a kid. It came out in 1983 when I was 5 or 6 years old. So if I did see it, most of the humor was probably completely over my head. But watching it as an adult, I found myself wondering, what exactly is the joke here? And I think there are basically two big jokes throughout the movie. The first is, they're Canadian! The second is they drink a lot of beer and they're kind of losers. And that's pretty much the foundation of the comedy question mark. There's the exaggerated Canadian accent, the A, the beer, the clothes, the van, the Toronto locations, and some of that is actually interesting from a Canadian perspective because I grew up seeing those kinds of things in my life as a Canadian. The van they drive around in looks like a van that could have been driving around when I was growing up. They're driving around Toronto, and Toronto looks exactly like Toronto because it really is Toronto. So there's a certain nostalgia to it, but nostalgia isn't necessarily comedy. The movie keeps reminding you, look, these guys are Canadian. Ha 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 ha. That's funny, right? People being Canadian. And I think that's where it absolutely loses me. Canadian comedy absolutely can be funny, but I think the best Canadian comedies don't make being Canadian the entire joke. Take Schitt's Creek, for example. You've got Canadian actors, Canadian locations, Canadian situations, and a very Canadian sensibility. But the comedy isn't constantly saying, hey, look how Canadian this is. It's just funny characters in funny situations. The same thing goes for something like Kim's Convenience. The fact that it's Canadian is part of the setting, but it isn't the punchline every 30 seconds. With Strange Brew, though, the Canadianness often feels like the punchline itself. And the accent is just another atrocious example of this. When the McKenzie brothers exaggerate the A, that's obviously supposed to be funny, but what's interesting is when they're just talking normally without constantly exaggerating the accent, that's actually much closer to how Canadians sound because they're Canadian actors. And Americans already find Canadian accents funny. They think we can't talk, they think we're mispronouncing words. It's an accent, buddy. Look it up. So sometimes I find myself thinking, why are we exactly exaggerating this? I also couldn't help thinking about Dumb and Dumber. Now, to be fair, it's been a long time since I've seen Dumb and Dumber. It might not be as funny as I remember it, but I think it was much funnier than this. And I don't think that comparison is like random. So Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas were doing this kind of dumb, clueless loser character comedy years before Dumb and Dumber came out came along. And Jim Carrey was coming up and around the same period, and obviously he's a Canadian comic as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if movies and characters like the McKenzie brothers were part of the comedy landscape that influenced the next generation. But I think the difference is that the McKenzie brothers themselves just aren't that funny to me. I burped. That's funny. They're ridiculous. They're stupid. They drink beer. They get into trouble. But I didn't find myself laughing very often. The plot is also pretty ridiculous, and plots can work. Ridiculous plots can work if the comedy is strong enough to carry them. But when you're already not laughing at the characters, the ridiculousness of the story just becomes more noticeable. There was one part of the movie that I actually really liked, though. Right at the beginning, there's this great meta joke, meta comedy setup involving their TV show, because the TV show comes from the sketch comedy show SCTV, um, involving their TV show and the transition to making a movie. They're basically playing with the difference between television and cinema, and the audience gets very angry about what they're watching and tries to murder them, and they escape in their van. That part felt much more clever to me. It reminded me of the kind of self-aware comedy you get with something like Blazing Saddles, where the movie is willing to make jokes about itself, the audience, and the fact that you're watching a movie. And I actually wish Strange Brew had leaned much harder into that. It might have been a much more enjoyable experience if it had. If it had kept that whole kind of meta approach, it would have been a lot better. Instead, it settles into the McKenzie Brothers single note comedy, you know, drinking beer, saying A, and getting into increasingly ridiculous situations. I don't know. Maybe that's why people love it. It's a very specific kind of comedy from a very specific time and place. And if you saw it when you were younger or you grew up with the McKenzie brothers, I can kind of understand why it would be nostalgic for you. But for me, watching it for the first time, or at least watching it as an adult for the first time, the nostalgia just isn't there. And without the nostalgia, I don't think that there's enough comedy left for me. So unfortunately, my final rating for Strange Brew is 2 out of 10. I know that's probably going to upset some Canadians, and some people are going to be like, you're not really Canadian. You can't hate Strange Brew, but hey, I watched the movie. That's my review. And if you don't like it, maybe take off, eh? But seriously, if you like what I do, please like the video, leave a comment, subscribe. I'm trying to get to at least 30 subscribers. That's my next milestone. We can do it together, boys and girls. Let's try it. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.